Hello, I'm Donald Lassier, and I'm the president and CEO of the Chicago History Museum. It is my honor to welcome you to this extremely important program. We hope to inspire you to learn more and do more. The political uprisings during the summer of 2020 represented the continued efforts of marginalized people to insist upon justice, equality, and the visibility of unknown or obscure narratives. Many of these demonstrations centered on monuments and the ways history has or has not been commemorated, and what the built monuments indicate about our society, inviting discourse, activism, and yes, even protest. Tonight's program features an interdisciplinary panel that will be offering perspectives on Abraham Lincoln's legacy, as well as the history and legacies of monuments in Chicago. The panel will also discuss contemporary inclusive art focused efforts to commemorate Chicago's stories. We'd like to thank the Chicago Monuments Project, our esteemed panel, and all of you who are participating this evening. With that, I will now be turning over this virtual microphone to our moderator. She is a Chicago Sun-Times columnist, a political strategist. Please welcome Ms. Laura S. Washington.
Thank you, President Lazier, and we are so happy to have you back in Chicago. Welcome.
Thank
And
you.
welcome to everyone in the audience and to our fabulous panel. I'm very honored to be participating in this conversation tonight with this stellar panel of experts on a very important topic. First, I'm going to introduce the panel, and then we're going to get in a couple little housekeeping things and get right into the conversation. Starting with Doug Keel, who is an assistant professor at Northwestern University, and he is also a citizen of the Oneida Nation. He studies Native American history with particular interest in the Great Lakes region and 20th century indigenous nation rebuilding. John Lowe is an associate professor of indigenous studies at Ohio State University and an enrolled citizen of the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi Indians. He serves on the Chicago Monuments Project Advisory Committee. Kate Mazur is an associate professor of history at Northwestern University. She specializes in the history of race, politics, and law in the 19th century United States. And Christine Mehring is the Mary L. Block Professor of Art History at the University of Chicago and an adjunct curator at the Smart Museum of Art in Chicago. Welcome all. We are going to be exploring a number of issues tonight of a very, very great importance to Chicago and the nation. And that does not exclude you. In fact, it includes you very much, you in the audience. There's going to be plenty of opportunity for you to participate. We're going to start tonight, though, with asking you a question right up front, and that is a poll question. We prepared several poll questions to get your input, your thoughts about this issue. We're going to be collecting this data and information and doing a report on it later. So you want to definitely participate in this. Poll question number 1. If some Chicago monuments are removed because of inaccurate or offensive depictions, does that erase their history? What we have is yes. The answer to yes is 18%. No, it does not erase their history, 76%. I am unsure, 6%. Interesting. And I'd like to start with you, John Lowe, to get your reaction to that poll. Do those results surprise you? And one of the important roles you play here in Chicago is on the Chicago Monuments Project. You serve on the advisory committee. Could you tell us a little bit about your work to date and what you're trying to accomplish?
Sure. Thank you very much. And thank you for having me. Thank you for letting me be on the panel. And welcome to everyone in the audience. Yeah, I'm a associate professor at Ohio State. I grew up near Chicago, Niles, Michigan, South Bend, Indiana area. I'm a citizen of the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi Indians. Chicago, I consider in a larger breadth my hometown. And so I'm very involved with all things Chicago. Wrote a book about Indians in Chicago, 2016. I'm on this committee for the Chicago Monuments Project. I think I was asked to be on the committee to bring one of many Native perspectives to that committee. I think I was asked also because Chicago is ancestral Potawatomi lands, and I'm Potawatomi. And I think I was asked because I have a chapter in my book about indigenous monuments in Chicago. And so perhaps for all those reasons, I was asked to join. And we're looking at, I think, what's the total, 41 monuments and statues that might be problematic. And we're engaged both tonight and in previous panels that I've been in and previous committee work in conversations, speaking with each other, learning from each other about perspectives and thoughts, ideas, and learning about history, problematic histories. And so I think, I forget who, but somebody in the earlier meeting made a great comment, and I was inspired by the poll numbers that you just referenced, that monuments don't have to be forever. You know, an exhibit at a museum gets curated on a regular basis, gets remodeled, refreshened, refurbished all the time. Just because we have monuments does not mean we can't rethink them, re-understand them, maybe re-celebrate them, or maybe take them down. And in addition, just because we have old monuments doesn't mean we can't have new monuments, new public art that celebrates new perspectives on people, places, and things in Chicago. So sorry for my long-winded answer to a straightforward question.
No, you and your last point about the monuments not being forever segues right into my next question, which I will address to Christine and the rest of the panel, and that is, what are monuments about? What are monuments for? What is the purpose of monuments in your perspective? Christine Marion?
Sorry. Thank you also for having me. I'm very, very excited about being a part. This is such an important topic, and I hope we'll have a lot more of these discussions. I mean, I think the very simple answer to this very difficult question is that, you know, there are past monuments. There's a kind of particular period of monuments that we're actually looking at, about 30 years, and we can talk in a little bit about what that period is and why it's so distinct. And I think that's very important to keep in mind, that we're looking at a very particular set of sculptures, monuments that came about in a very particular historical moment in United States history. And those monuments, I think it's pretty clear to all of us, were about celebrating a particular individual or particular event, mostly coming out of white historical narratives, of course. And they were meant to be celebratory, and these were, you know, heroic figures.
And this was just to clarify, so everyone knows, what period of time are we talking about when
roughly about late 19th century to about 1930s. The whole sequence of sculptures identified by the commission are mostly kind of in that period. And these monuments were very much about a kind of collective civic self-representation, and trying to inspire some self-reflection of US society at the time. Now, I want to make sure that that's a very particular historical definition of monuments, but there are many, many other ways in which we can think about monuments. And I think that that's something that's so important, is that we think about what can a monument be today that is not this tied to this definition of that particular historical moment. You know, it's possible to have monuments that have much more nuance, that have much more complexity. There are, of course, possibilities for monuments with many different kinds of narratives around marginalized cultures and figures and stories, etc. And those are, of course, the ones that are missing, and those are the ones that we need. I think it's also important to think about the fact that many other cultures, you know, have different terms, different types of traditions. One of my I'm a native German, and one of my favorite words of all time in German is the term Denkmal, which is actually the German equivalent of monument. It literally means thinking mark. So why not think about monuments as kind of objects that help us to begin to think and begin to debate, and that kind of mark a place or mark a moment in time but are not necessarily fixed in their meaning, but open up to discussion and debate. I mean, that to me is the type of monument that I wish we had more of here.
And of course, this is a form, these monuments are a form of public art, but back to the period you referred to earlier, there wasn't the kind of public art that there is today. So these monuments, these representations can take many, many different forms other than what we traditionally think of as a statue.
Exactly, exactly.
Kate Mazur, I'd love to have you jump into this conversation. What is your perspective on what monuments are about and how we should think about them currently?
Thank you for that. Thanks for inviting me to be here. And I'm so interested in Christine's perspective that she just expressed. I'm not an art historian. I'm a historian whose general specialization has been in the mid-19th century and the Civil War and Reconstruction. And I have been paying attention not only to what's going on in Chicago, but in the recent past at debates and controversies about Confederate monuments, and also my own efforts to get a memorialization or sort of monument to the Reconstruction era, which resulted in part in the creation of the National Park's first site that commemorates Reconstruction, a period that was often suppressed and kind of disregarded and misinterpreted for over 100 years after the Civil War. So I guess one of the things that I've thought about in all of this, and again, this is from a kind of lay historian, not art historian perspective, is that monuments are about power. So, in addition to maybe, we're looking at monuments in Chicago right now that were constructed between about the 1890s and the 1930s. They are also about who has the power to define what should be admired and commemorated at a given moment, and who has the clout and connections to make those monuments happen. So, for example, one of the things that comes up a lot with discussions of Confederate monuments is in many communities, there never was a public discussion about whether to put a Confederate monument up. It would be like a group, the United Daughters of the Confederacy or something, would raise money, and then they would be powerful. They would talk to the mayor, the city council, and say, hey, let's put a monument in the front of the courthouse that commemorates the Confederacy. Okay, fine, go ahead. And so, what we see on our landscape is the product of lots and lots of decisions like that have to do with kind of power and resources, and that don't always even reflect a deliberative process from the time that the monuments were constructed. And so part of what I like about this moment and this project in Chicago is the opportunity to have a more deliberative process it's not only more inclusive, it's not only rethinking who should be commemorated in art on this landscape, but also who or what ideas, but also there's a process of getting input, there's a process of discussion. So it is trying, in my perspective as an outsider to the commission, to not have it be the usual kind of small group of powerful people deciding what gets commemorated and what doesn't.
So in many ways, when you talk about power, the power should be shifting or is shifting from connected people who make a decision to raise money to the community at large being engaged. And that's where the real center of power should be when we talk about monuments and think about how we want to erect monuments today. That's a great point. Doug, what's your perspective on this in terms of how you think about monuments?
Yeah, thanks for this great question. And also thanks for the invite to join this really great panel. Yeah, I think that's such an important point too, that Kate just raised about how piecemeal, this sort of, process of commemoration is, and how different it is to walk into those kinds of processes with intent, right, and a wider civic sense of goals. There's the purpose of monuments in some ways, and then there's the function, right? I mean, we could talk about them a variety of different angles. One that comes to mind for me, John, has a familiarity with the wider monuments and commemorations of Native people around the city of Chicago, for instance. One function that public art has when it invokes imagery of Native people in particular, right? So that's to say that there's what are the goals of a monument, but then there are also what is happening, right, when American monuments engage the imagery of Native people. And that those processes are often about making nationalist claims, right, and about establishing American presence and distinction too, right? In a past and present sort of way, right? That symbols of Americanness are those of the future, and references to Native people are somehow meant to be of a closed past, right? So that's one type of work that they often do in the specific context of trying to inscribe what is, in so many ways, right, a deeper history into a landscape that is not one in which Euro-Americans have thousands of years of history, and so it's about inscribing in so many ways a sacred history of Americans' own, right? Turning Illinois, right, already an indigenous word, into the land of Lincoln, for instance, right? And I think another way to think about the purpose of monuments, I think another way we can engage them is as someone who well, many of us, most of us work in doing museum exhibitions or in some form, right? And so we all know that monuments, they're if they were designed to be sites of educational engagement, they're done really poorly, right? There's not a whole lot of opportunity for engagement when a monument is presented in such a way in a monolithic sense that doesn't even seem to open space for questions, right? But is instead to communicate to us greatness, right? So already, a certain narrative has been made, right? And I think that's a cultural practice too. That's to say that thinking from indigenous points of view, for instance, well, it's an unusual practice. In our most important stories, for instance, of the peacemaker in our formation of the Great Iroquois Law of Peace, we don't refer to the peacemaker's actual name, right? It's a different kind of association, and and in so many indigenous communities, for instance, the idea of creating a monument to a single individual would be an odd choice, right? So that's a distinctly Euro-American set of decisions, right? Though not only, but but it has its own cultural context too, I think.
It's interesting you make the point about you called Illinois the land of indigenous people, which became the land of Lincoln, which really dovetails into your point about monuments to individuals, to powerful, famous people, as opposed to the people of the land, the people who represent the land. And that's sort of a cultural shift that we made a long time ago that maybe some people would argue we need to make again. Another question for all of you, and whoever wants to jump in on this one, as we know, and the reason why we have we're having this conversation right now is the discussion of monuments has been very polarizing here and across the country. What do you all think are the elements that are fueling these tensions around monuments, and how do we address those? Yeah. Why do we, maybe it's an obvious question, but why are there so many tensions right now around monuments?
Maybe I'll jump in because I'm, as someone who works a lot on public art, I'm so used to tensions around public art. The interesting thing is usually with respect to public art today, or in a sort of broader global context, the biggest debate is usually about, this is not art. I don't think this is art. This shouldn't be here. This is a very, very different kind of debate that we're talking about with respect to these historic monuments, and especially Confederate monuments. And Kate and others will have a lot more to say about this, but it seems to me, as a kind of art historian outsider to the historical piece, that the debates we have are because these issues that these monuments raise are just to this day unresolved. They're unresolved historical, social, and political issues, right? It's an incomplete fulfillment of the 13th Amendment, of true equality in this country, et cetera. And I'm always fascinated by comparing this a little bit to the German history and the kind of commemoration of the Holocaust. I mean, there's a way in which I wrestled for a long time as someone growing up young in Germany with how slow our country was coming to terms with the past. But when I compare this to the US, I mean, this is mind-boggling. That's number one. I think the second one is that this kind of collective representation might just be impossible, right? I mean, public art, in some sense, I don't think you can ever have a public artwork that pleases or that satisfies everybody. I think that there is inevitably, in a good democracy, a diversity of opinions. How artworks mean changes over time. There've got to be nuances, and Lincoln. These people are very complicated historical figures. I think it's asking a lot of these monuments that were erected as heroic representations to fulfill that role. They just don't.
No, and maybe that's okay. We can't
Exactly.
always agree. We have different perspectives, so it's okay. But then, how do we deal with the tensions and polarization? How do we address that, or is it okay to have those tensions? Is that just part of the democratic process? Is that part of the conversation? Anyone else on the panel want to jump in on that, or is it okay for us to have anger and debate and conversations and Facebook fights about this issue?
In terms of what makes it polarizing, I think part of it is its permanence, right? I mean, I think that's a key element. I mean, following what Christine's saying about the possibilities of public art as places for exchange, right? But that means a lively, continuously changing, right, sort of environment. So I think that's one source of frustration, right, is their permanence. And I think from another point of view, it's sort of from one group's point of view, something is rather obvious, right? Such as statues of Christopher Columbus, right? And for others, it requires some explanation. We're going to be talking about Lincoln. What possibly is there to be said about Lincoln? Well, he too has a complicated history, and but I think the lack of a dynamic of change, right? And I think I think that contributes to to some of the frustration.
John, did you want to participate?
Yeah, I was just going to add, Laura, that it's a great question, and I would agree with the idea that lively debate is wonderful for society. But I think Doug hit the nail on the head, is that these statues are made out of granite, limestone, marble on purpose, right? There's a permanence that is intended there. The saying, "It's written in stone." This is an ossified history. Is intentionally not meant to allow for a change of the narrative or a discussion of the narrative, and so that's the problematics with it, is that that it represents an agenda, either for celebration over conquest, or nostalgia, or some mix of a sense that certainly when I'm in Chicago, many times I think to myself, that's not my history. That's not the history I know to be. But Doug's right that there's no opportunity to engage in a conversation about it. It is what it is, and so that's the problem.
And that creates a tremendous frustration, obviously. I want to get more into Lincoln, Lincoln is at the sort of the center of this program tonight. But first, I want to go to another poll question, which gets at some of the issues that have come up in this debate. And this poll question is, I think we're going to see on the screen shortly. In your opinion, which of the Chicago Monuments Project guidelines are most important to the selection process? 1, promoting narratives of white supremacy. 2, presenting inaccurate and/or demeaning characterizations of American Indians. 3, memorializing individuals with connections to racist acts, slavery, and genocide. Or presenting selective, oversimplified, one-sided views of history. Number 5, not sufficiently including other stories, in particular, those of women, people of color, and themes of labor, migration, and community building. And finally, creating tension between people who see value in these artworks and those who do not. Please take a moment to answer your question, to pick your answer, and we're going to read back the results shortly. It's amazing how quickly these things can pop up like this. People are eager to have their voices heard. It doesn't take long, and we're going to see it in a second. And then I'm going to move to Lincoln, as I said, who is sort of at the middle of this whole debate. And I actually have a great question that I'm going to jump from the queue. I'm going to jump ahead on the Q&A because we're already getting great questions. So, okay, so the answers are promoting narratives of white supremacy, 13%, presenting inaccurate or demeaning characterizations, 7%, memorializing individuals with connections to racist acts, slavery, and genocide, 17%, presenting selective, oversimplified, one-sided views of history, only 3%, not sufficiently including other stories, in particular those of women, people of color, themes of labor, migration, and community building, 57%, and creating tension between people who see value in these artworks and those who do not, only 3%. So it looks like the majority with the 57% went with the issue of not telling other narratives, which is very interesting. So I want to go to you, Kate, and I want to ask you about Lincoln, because he is, as someone said earlier, a very complicated individual. And in fact, 5 of the statues that the Chicago Monuments Project is looking at depict Lincoln. And there's this general perception that Abraham Lincoln was a great emancipator, a rail splitter, a statesman. But of course, the historical facts paint a far more complex picture. And I saw something in the chat earlier from, oh yes, here it is. A great question from the audience. This person said, sometimes I think that much or all of what could be seen negatively about Lincoln are the ways he has been understood or used or symbolized after his death, rather than who he actually was. For example, I don't think the land of Lincoln was something he claimed. That was something that was imposed by others, I assume, after his death. So, Kate, if you would as a Lincoln expert, if you would take this one on, he was far more complex than those statues might represent.
Yeah, and I think so. It's my job to say a little bit about who Lincoln was, and obviously entire books and many, many books, in fact, probably more, I think, books than more books have been written about Lincoln than any other individual in history except for Jesus Christ or something like that. So, you know, what I'm gonna touch on now is really at the tip of the iceberg, but just to kind of cut to some of the key issues. So Lincoln is known as the great emancipator. And as you said, rail splitter, statesman. He certainly did come from a humble background. It's interesting that 3 states claim him: Kentucky, Indiana, and Illinois all claim Lincoln. He lived in all 3. And Lincoln, so when it came to slavery, Lincoln was on record very early in his adult life being morally opposed to slavery. And throughout his whole political career, there's actually no doubt that he had a real moral aversion to the institution of slavery. When it came to the question of, well, what would a post-slavery United States look like? What should the role of African Americans be who are free? The answer is a lot more complicated. Let me also just say Lincoln also was not an abolitionist. So there were people who were much more outspoken about moral opposition to slavery than Lincoln during Lincoln's own era. And that included both Black and white abolitionists who Lincoln stayed away from, because if you were a radical abolitionist at the time, you also could not have a political career, particularly in Illinois. So Lincoln, you know, the trade-off, if we could say, was not that he would have otherwise, we don't know if he would have otherwise aligned himself with the abolitionists, but he was a politician, and to be a politician, you really couldn't do that regardless. When it came to free African Americans, he had his doubts about whether the United States could be a racially egalitarian society, a multiracial society. And so in the 1850s, for example, he was a member of the Illinois Colonization Society. This was an organization led by prominent white men that was interested in eventually having free Black people leave this country and settle in Liberia. And that is a complicated sort of story about colonizationists, but it was basically, the movement was founded in a real pessimism about the capacity of the United States to be a multiracial democracy. So their solution was, in some kind of fantasy, like, we think that Black people should leave and go to Africa and settle in there, probably in Liberia. And we see that Lincoln continued to kind of voice these colonizationist ideas even into his presidency. At the same time, however, in the political climate that Lincoln was operating in, he was speaking, let's say in the late 1850s in Illinois, on behalf of the fundamental rights of free African Americans and indeed all African Americans. So for example, he was a Republican, and the Republicans were aligned behind the idea that the Declaration of Independence was intended to apply to everyone, not just white people, but everyone. By contrast, the Democrats of that era went around saying that this was a white man's country, and the founders of this country believed that the Declaration should apply only to white people. And so Stephen Douglas said that regularly, right? And Abraham Lincoln countered, no, that's not true. And this country was actually made for anyone. These rights, these fundamental rights were there for everyone. So this is a way in which Lincoln is complicated, right? On the one hand, advocating colonization, on the other hand, advocating sort of basic fundamental rights for all people. And another thing to add about Lincoln is, and one of the aspects of him that is truly admirable, I think, is that as president, as a leader, he showed a capacity to change. And so it's well known that, you know, over the course of his presidency, he actually increasingly moved toward the position that abolitionists had staked out for a long time on questions of slavery, abolition, the right of African American men to vote. So I'm going to just stop there, and then I would like to sort of turn it over, because there's a whole other part of the story of Lincoln with respect to Native Americans that I think other panelists can speak to better than I can.
Absolutely, and I was going to ask Doug to pick up that. There's actually more to the story of his very complex relationship with race and race relations. And Doug Keel, you could fill us in on issues and challenges with the Native American community.
Sure. And, you know, and afterwards, if John has anything to add, feel free. You know, I mean, I think these questions, raise, a set of questions about how to think about our history, right? In terms of, there's US history, there's Illinois history. And what I'm getting at is that the events that are associated with Lincoln in regards to Native American history, and those events that are seared in people's memory, are events of Minnesota history. And I think even for many in Minnesota, there's an argument to be made that the Dakota War of 1862, otherwise variously called the Sioux Uprising, was an incredibly tragic event. It's not an event that is primarily characterized by Lincoln's hand, but it is memorably concluded in such a way. This uprising in Minnesota arises out of a long-standing set of tensions, primarily about annuity checks and Indian agents and malfeasance and government irresponsibility in regards to local conditions with the Indian agency in Minnesota at that time. But though that may sound like it's an administrative struggle, it was on the, people were on the edge of starvation, and people were indeed starving and waiting for supplies urgently. And one of these figures in Minnesota famously, repeatedly, referred to, the Dakotas can go ahead and eat grass, right? That was how empathetic he was to their concerns. And so this is the toxic nature of what's going on in Minnesota at this time. And this is the conditions out of which an uprising springs, and an attack on a settler community in New Ulm. And the events that are primarily associated with Lincoln are how the Dakota War concludes with the largest mass execution in U.S. history. 38 Dakota men are hung hanged in Mankato. The original number, the degree of vengeance that Minnesota officials wanted for this event was unthinkable. They would have seen 300 people hanged for the events of the Sioux Uprising, and I'll talk later about the events of Sand Creek and how those events are similar.
So how did Lincoln play a role in this?
Yeah. Sorry, as I ramble, as perhaps historians do, but
there's a lot to unpack.
Yes, and so Lincoln's role is that the number is initially 300, and Lincoln gets that number down to 38, right? So we can see that as that is Lincoln's particular calculus of justice, right? And the governor of Minnesota is not happy with that number, urges to see more. Even you'll lose Republican votes in the 1864 election if you go ahead and do this, and he famously says that he can't hang men for votes. So I think what's important to take from that is, yes, this represents Abraham Lincoln's sense of justice. Only 38 men who are most connected to the events of the uprising, but also, yes, this is the largest mass execution in U.S. history. So the idea that this smaller event, it gives you a sense of the scale of violence of the 19th century, right? And
their definition of justice.
Yes.
Justice was done in this case, in their view, because it was only 30 something as opposed to 300 something.
That's the argument. And I would point to like I said, I'll talk later about the events of the Sand Creek Massacre, which kind of give you a sense of how catastrophic such events could have been. It very well could have been hundreds, and in the case of Sand Creek, it was. And so Lincoln's role in this is ultimately in getting the number down, but that's to say, in Dakota communities, the memory of the Dakota 38, it's a national symbol. It's commemorated every year. It's something that's mourned every year. And so in thinking about different layers and registers of history, there's American history, there's a wider sense of Native American history, but specifically in the world of Dakota history, Abraham Lincoln casts a very large shadow, right? And that's really what we're talking about here. And the state of Minnesota has gone through serious efforts, public commemoration, year-long commemoration events and public exhibitions and things about the Dakota War to encourage a greater sense of public understanding, because those events took place in Minnesota, right? But here in Illinois, we don't necessarily learn about the events of Mankato, Minnesota, 1862. It's not as connected to us, right? That's part of Lincoln's story, though, right? And so,
but yet we have these 5 statues here in Chicago that sit on that stand of that history, and so many of us are not aware of that history.
Indeed.
John, did you want to comment or add to this question?
Yeah, thank you. I like the comments in the chat that somebody made about how it's perhaps better to look at a person as doing heroic things rather than being a hero. And I think Abraham Lincoln obviously did some heroic things, but he's not a hero in Indian country. This was a war, as Doug explained. This was a conflict. People were fighting for their lives, and for the lives of their loved ones, their children, their elders. Indian people were fighting to avoid starvation. This was a desperate situation that was forced upon them by American expansion into Minnesota. Lincoln knew all of this. Lincoln was well aware of the fact that these warriors were not treated as prisoners of war. They were treated as criminals, and that they were adjudicated through the criminal process rather than the prisoner of war process. He was aware of the fact that there had been up to as many as, I think, 42 trials in one day. These people were being afforded a 5-minute trial in which their life rested upon the decision. And Lincoln would have been aware of that. And so ironically, I think it is, and someone else correct me if you know better, but Kate perhaps, but it's like 3 days after the mass hanging, the largest mass hanging ever to occur in the United States. 3 days later, Lincoln signs the Emancipation Proclamation. That's an incredible contradiction, right? Of empathy and connectedness to disconnect, right? And he's a complicated guy, and and you're right. I did not know about the Dakota War. Doug, I did not know about the Dakota War until I went up to the University of Minnesota and read a very good book called The Dakota Conflict. And until that, it was not a part of what I thought about when I thought about Abraham Lincoln, but it is now. And so that's the, I think the work of the project is to flush out these details, and then we all need to think about how to, what's the most effective way to address these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And that leads right into the next part of the discussion, and that is around what do we do? All of these figures, whether it's Lincoln or many of the other heroic figures or so-called heroic figures that are part of monuments, they're there. There's a history there. The history happened in a particular finite moment in time, but we're in a different time now. And what do we do in contemporary time to allow for the flexibility to change the conversation and change these monuments? Do we take them down? Do we modify them? Do we add placards to them? What are some of the kinds of things we can do that you're thinking about and maybe that some of you are working on? And Christine, I want to start with you as an art historian and given your experience around these issues. You know, what are you thinking about and looking at around this issue of what do we do now contemporary? Are there things that you've seen in other cities or here in Chicago that are sort of trying to take on these complexities?
Yeah, sure. I try to bring a few examples, and if we want to start maybe with slide 9 while I start talking. So I mean, I think that there are two separate things. One is what do we do with the historic monuments that we already have, and then what are the possibilities for new commissions, and what do we do with historic monuments? Obviously, we can remove, we can destroy, we can store, we can exhibit them somewhere else, store them, and figure out what to do with them over time. Most importantly, we can for sure recontextualize. And so, Laura, you just mentioned already there are all sorts of educational materials and contextualization that one can do. Plaques, of course, but we're living in this amazing new age of new media. There's fantastic web-based kind of contextualization that one can do. One could do augmented reality kind of interventions, right? Either educationally or artist-based. And then, of course, we can have new commissions, and I think those new commissions just have to be thoughtful about collective input, about what goes up in the first place, so that we don't make these mistakes again. And I think be mindful of the relativity also, I have to say, and have some humility about our own present, about our own assumptions and about our own knowledge, that may not be appreciated or may change in the future. So here are a few examples of sort of artistic interventions. The slide that's up here is Dustin Klein and Alex Tricky, who projected for the 40 days following the murder of George Floyd on the Robert E. Lee Monument in Richmond, images of Frederick Douglass, Ida B. Wells, Harriet Tubman, sort of alternative histories, basically. Next slide. I was involved in curating last year for the University of Chicago a commission by American artist Jenny Holzer called You Be My Ally, which basically allowed you to project quotes from our core curriculum onto reality around you. And I took one here of a Hannah Arendt quote, "Reality is not guaranteed," virtually projected on my phone on the Statue of the Republic, which is one of the monuments that's part of the commission. So this is sort of an example of how one can kind of, you can make your own intervention onto existing monuments. Is an intervention that I also co-curated around the Henry Moore sculpture, Nuclear Energy, which commemorates the first man-made nuclear fission. Installation by Ogryziak Prillinger architects called Nuclear Thresholds, which is a kind of bench / sculpture that works with the kind of tension of control, simplicity, and the loss of control and complexity in the nuclear age. Temporary installation. This is something that we should have so much more of in Chicago, and I really hope this comes out of this commission. And then another example is my dear colleague Jessica Stockholder's intervention in two public sculptures in Utrecht, which she connected through her kind of abstract intervention. And then I also want to give a shout out to the many teachers at various universities and colleges who are working with students on on coming up with ideas for new monuments and interventions. So my colleague Nutan Barani taught a class on having students propose new monuments for Washington Park, so like related to select pieces within Southside history. We have amazing artists here in Chicago. You know, think about Amanda Williams, William Pope L. We should be commissioning these artists to create interventions or create new monuments. And then quickly, next slide, I want to mention what can happen with monuments when we remove them. We don't have to destroy them. We don't have to put them in storage, never to be seen again. There are ways in which we can create thoughtful installations. And this is one of my sort of favorite places with respect to this. It's the Citadel in Spandau, which is a small town outside of Berlin, where basically a large number of monuments from Berlin history, all the way from the 19th century, through National Socialist monuments, through socialist monuments from East Germany that I think it's fair to say probably littered East Berlin and all over East Germany when the wall came down. They had to go. It was, you know, not all of them went. And so they gathered a lot of them in this very large citadel and reinstalled them in very thoughtful ways. So in the background there, for example, you see a gigantic head of Lenin, for example. So there are ways of keeping, recontextualizing and re-educating. And then I just have a few examples of some new commissions that are fantastic. And I won't say much about it since we're so out of time. Here's Kenda Wiley, who is the same artist who painted Barack Obama's portrait, of course. His 2019 sculpture that first premiered in Times Square in New York called Rumors of War, and then moved to Richmond in the context of all the Confederate monuments there. An African-American man in streetwear on a horse, sort of very much the style of these Confederate monuments, but basically replacing the rider. Then next one, Amanda Williams, commissioned to, as part of the She Built Commission in New York City, a monument to the first African-American Congresswoman, Shirley Chisholm. Really fantastic kind of precedents in post-war Germany commemorating the Holocaust. Here's Christian Boltanski, French artist, intervention in the old Jewish quarter in Berlin, in a kind of bombed out site where, you know, the building is gone, and he basically installed plaques of all the individuals who lived in these apartments at various levels with their profession, their names, and their birth and death dates. And then last one is Esther and Jochen Gerz, Monument Against Fascism from 1986. So, you know, Germany wrestled with this question of what can new monuments look like very early on, comparatively speaking. So this is a monument against fascism, which included a statement against fascism, which visitors were encouraged to sign, to kind of pledge to support the statement against fascism and to look out for neo-fascist tendencies. And as this stele or a monument filled up with signatures of people committing themselves against fascism, it was lowered into the ground until it was all the way gone. So I'll leave you with that. If you have great artists, they will have great ideas. Absolutely.
Thank you, Christine, for that really rich presentation and so many hopeful examples of what can be done in this time. Could I just ask for a quick round from the other panelists before we move to Q&A? If you could suggest one way that artists, historians, and community members can collaborate to produce or review monuments in a way that can educate and enlarge our understanding. What's one way? I'll start with you, Doug Keel, that the community can collaborate on this issue.
Well, I'll just give one real example of public art that a local artist is doing. Local artist Santiago X has created mounds, earthen mounds, really all based on the premise of if we're to, reconceptualize what it would look like to, make Chicago indigenous, right, and to create spaces that were for welcoming Native community, right? Then that would include, making public art and monuments and such that reflect our own aesthetic and own traditions, right? And so Santiago's idea is people have been making mounds in this part of of North America. It's a deep tradition, and for himself, who has roots in the Southeast from also a Mound tradition community. So that's one example of of being bringing earthen mounds into a public park as a way of creating indigenous community.
Great, thank you. Kate Mazer, you have one example of work
I guess
communities and how they can work together?
I mean, I think we've had wonderful examples, and I want to just make one point that doesn't have to do. I love the various things that Christine just showed us, and it's so inspiring. And the same with the example of Santiago X. I guess I want to say that when the conversation really heated up about Confederate monuments, a lot of people said something like, well, it's one thing to put monuments up, but it's another thing to take them down. It's bad to take them down. Like, let's put up more, but definitely don't take them down. That's bad. That's destructive. That's not what like democracies do. And I felt like I really didn't understand that. And I think John's earlier comments about, monuments, they might seem really permanent, but actually this is we collectively are and should be in control and in charge of making these kind of decisions. And it occurred to me in the context of the Confederate monuments that especially in cities, I mean, it's so weird to me and hypocritical to argue that monuments should not be taken down and that there's something distinctly different about taking them down versus putting them up when urban landscapes are constantly changing, right? We are constantly building things up, taking them down, deciding that we don't want this here, but we do want this there. And that's the nature of sort of modern life as a person in this world. And so to kind of reserve off a certain category of things, that is to say monuments, and say that, yeah, but these can't be touched. It's strange to me. And I think it really, we need to, if for those people who might be here who are thinking that, I think it's worth examining sort of why you may have that view. I don't want to go on for too long, but just that some monuments have what art historians would argue are of value because they're created by a famous artist. They're an example of a certain kind of sculpture that was very innovative or very important at a particular time. Many monuments are not that, right? Many were mass produced. Many are not special artistically. And so, that's another consideration, right? Are we calling for keeping everything when, there's like 100 of a particular kind of monument scattered all over this country? So, I think we need to kind of use our critical faculties on this question, just like we would on just about any other difficult question. We're talking about sharing a conversation among people who are diverse and won't necessarily agree on everything.
So agree, Kate. That's way too much bad art out there.
Well said. But thank you, Kate. And I'm going to just read one of the great questions that we're getting from the audience, and then I want to go to you, John. And it says, ancient Greek and Egyptian monuments were outdated at some point. How much of that history was destroyed in the name of transient contemporary sensibilities? An example, there's much of our ancient history that is gone because someone didn't think it was of value anymore. So. Great question. John Lowe, what would you like to weigh in on here?
Oh, sure. I mean, being director of the Newark Earthworks Center here in Ohio, we live that every day because we have Earthworks, the Octagon, which was an incredible lunar and planetary observatory and sacred space that has a golf course on top of it. So, so it's, things get used and reused, and so hopefully someday soon we'll be able to return it without the golf course to public access like it was intended to be. So one of my favorite statues was Simon Pokagon, who spoke at the Columbian Exposition here in Chicago, Great White City. In 1893, spoke in front of 70,000 people. And he put up a monument. As Doug mentioned earlier, Indians aren't big into monuments, but Simon was trying to engage Americans in all sorts of ways. And he put up a birch bark teepee on the Midway near the entrance to the exposition. And that TB traveled around in Chicago, it was because it's an iconic representation of who's Indian, what is Indian. Simon always referenced that Chicago, don't forget the sacrifices that we Indian people made so that you can have your 500-year celebration, right? You know, that we want to be a part of the American experience, part of the social fabric of America. Give us a chance, you know, and so, you know, that's, there was supposed to be a statue of Simon Pokagon after his death put up in Jackson Park. Pennies were collected from Chicago school children and somebody embezzled the money, so the statue never got put up. That might have been my second favorite statue in Chicago. But I think it's great what other people have said. It's not just about removing all things, but there are probably some things that need to be removed. Some things could be added. I think Santiago X is a great example of an artist doing big art that is really meaningful as well as aesthetically pleasing. I know that on the committee, what we're looking for is we don't want to be autocratic. We want to be transparent. We want to have a sense of inclusion. And we're going about the business of trying to find out what are the best practices for evaluating monuments. And we don't assume that we know everything. And we're trying to put in the back in the closet our own agendas or our own biases or our own issues. We can bring perspectives, but we need to listen to other people's perspectives too. And we want to see what other cities are doing also around the country and around the world with their exhibits. And I think there's a lot of examples that we can learn from. So really appreciate your audience being here today and the great comments that have been going on.
We don't have to reinvent the wheel, absolutely. And we're getting a lot of great comments and questions. We have just a few more minutes, so I want to try to get to as many of them as I can. And I want to take this one to Doug. Given the history of genocide and displacement of Native Americans, how shall we think about these images that were created in the late 19th and 20th centuries? How should we think about these given what you shared with us and John shared with us tonight?
Yeah, I think what's important to keep in mind is, the historical context surrounding their creation, right? What I mentioned earlier about what are a lot of implicitly nationalist aims of certain American commemorations and monuments, right? So I mean, I think that's one important way to think about the kind of work that they're doing, especially at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th. This is a period of American consciousness about their own modernity. And one way of framing these kinds of questions from a point of view of Native American history, the way that some authors have written about it, particularly Jeannie O'Brien in a book called Firsting and Lasting, which is really a great book about really showing you piece by piece how a history is erased, right? And oh my God, I lost my train of thought with that. But I was thinking Jeannie O'Brien, Histories of Genocide. I'll come back to it. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No problem. No problem. There's so much more to discuss. While you think about that, I'm going to go to another question. And this is a more general one. Could these monuments be seen as primary sources to teach us about the time when they were created? It's not just about the present and what we know now. It's about what we knew then and what that told us about the time. Could they be used in that way?
I really think so. And I mean, I think that we don't want to, as it were, litter our cities with these monuments. But I do think it's important, personally, to keep some and present them in appropriate ways with interventions, with context, etc. Because we can't completely erase this history because it's also a warning for the present and the future, right? And I think that is the most important function that these monuments can probably play today. There's a danger in a kind of certain presentism of thinking that we have all the answers and we're better than they were in history. And I think we need to preserve a sense of the alienness of history.
Well, we can't literally erase history. History is with us, and if we do erase it, then we can't learn from it, right? Anyone else have a thought on this question? How do we use these monuments to teach us about that moment in time, Kate?
Yeah, I mean, I think judiciously. I mean, another, just to refer again to the Confederate monument debate, I mean, and that's not what we're talking about here, actually, interestingly enough, right? That we have a lot of statues of Lincoln, in part because we are in the area that was fighting in the end to abolish slavery. So we don't around here have the baggage of dealing with those monuments. But the discussion about contextualization versus removal of the Confederate monuments, I think was sort of different. Anyway, my point is, yes, I think we can keep some of these older monuments, again, through this discussion that is ongoing, that I think is really great. And keep some and contextualize them through, and additional plaques also don't have to be boring. I mean, I love the idea of artistically adding to these, or you know, kind of helping to change the narrative. An example from Washington, D.C. is this monument to Lincoln. It's an emancipation monument that's now under discussion, of a kneeling enslaved man with Lincoln with his hand up as if kind of to say rise. And it's a very kind of patronizing monument. It's on the other side of the park. This is about 12 blocks east of the Capitol, is installed a gigantic monument to Mary McLeod Bethune, an amazing African-American woman who served in President Roosevelt's cabinet. And I'm not trying to say, I'm not taking a position on the Lincoln Monument right now, but just to say that, you know, adding, changing, contextualizing, changing the narrative, all these things are things that can be sort of under discussion, because there is some value to being able to go see a monument and sort of say, okay, at this time, look at how people commemorated this particular kind of person or this kind of event. So I think, you know, in my view, that type of thing should be in the mix for precisely the reasons Christine was just describing.
And maybe adding one piece here too is that I think Chicago is in many ways in a very privileged position, because we didn't get to say this earlier, so many of these monuments problematic monuments that we have now were erected with funding from an endowment given by Benjamin Ferguson for public art in the city. This endowment still exists, and it's overseen by the Art Institute trustees. It paid for things like the Statue of Republic, Laredo Taft's Fountain of Time, the Bowman and Spearman on Congress Parkway, etc. There's something very beautiful thinking about using those same funds that were spent on erecting these problematic monuments to create interventions, to commission contemporary artists to intervene in them, and to kind of have that continuity. And it's amazing that we have this endowment. There are, you know, very, very few cities that have an endowment dedicated to public art. So we have incredible opportunities here.
Something to be proud of. I want to squeeze in one more poll of the audience before we go to our final questions. And this, if we want to pull up the last poll question, which is, are Chicago monuments necessary to preserve our history? Are Chicago monuments necessary to preserve our history? Yes, no, or I am unsure. And that goes right to that question that we were just discussing about whether or not, if we erase the monuments, what does that say about our history? Okay, our Chicago monuments.
One quick thing I should probably say, Danny Schulman just noted in the chat that there's not much left in the Ferguson Fund, which I find super surprising because it's an endowment. So if that is the case, and I'm sure Daniel knows, we need to figure out why that is and create a new one.
Absolutely, absolutely. So the poll results: are Chicago monuments necessary to preserve our history? 55% say yes, 36% say no, and 9% are unsure. Okay, so we have a couple more questions we want to get to here. This one's a real interesting, challenging one, but important to discuss. Monuments are objected to now because they were built by wealthy men. Now it appears the standards of commemoration should be dictated by who can shout the loudest in our era. Should we just look at an ever-swinging pendulum? So that this questioner feels that the pendulum is swung from wealthy men to the loudest. Maybe you don't necessarily agree with that assessment, but how would you answer that question? Are we just looking at a swinging of the pendulum?
I mean, I think that this panel and the work of the Monuments Commission to the, the transparency, the invitation for participation, the thoughtfulness, the deliberativeness with which the process is being undertaken is not about deciding based on who shouts the loudest. It's about attempting in a profoundly polarized climate, attempting to have a conversation about what is meaningful, what we want to remember, and when I say we, I mean as many, the broadest possible we in that. And I'll also say that, it, in my view, as a historian who spends almost all my time reading and writing and teaching about the past, the history of people and of this community and of any community is about change. And so the notion that we would reevaluate what is important to us, that's not something to be maligned. That's not something to say, oh, just blowing where the wind blows, change. Oh, no, it's actually because we change as a community, our values change, hopefully they become more democratic, more inclusive. And so it's entirely appropriate to reevaluate where we stand with our public art. And it doesn't reflect, I mean, it's, to be sure it reflects change, but it's not change that is to be looked down upon or condescended to. It's actually about bringing our landscape up to represent or do a better job representing who lives here and what we collectively value.
Does anyone else want to weigh in on that? I think you covered it, Kate. The next question is, can monuments memorializing Chicago's indigenous history help reconcile historical and contemporary Native cultural erasure? Should the monument be coupled with deeper actual reconciliation? It's really interesting. This goes beyond the history and the discussion about the history, but reconciliation around the damage that has been done.
I would definitely say, real reform, in addition to monuments, for sure. Just thinking of a couple of examples of processes happening locally in Chicago, for instance, at the Field Museum. John and I are both involved there. John has a new exhibit just opening up. Go check it out. And the main Native North America Hall, it had an exhibition for over 60 years, right? It's unrealistic, right? And it's not good practice even to assume somehow that something that one puts in place 60 years ago, right, is still going to have the same kind of relevance, the same speak to the same kinds of questions, right? Understanding that these kinds of things are variable. So a key component of that process moving forward is not just gutting the old exhibit at the Field Museum, but as a rule, it's going to be constantly changing in the future moving forward, right? Reflecting an idea, right? I think learning from parallel kinds of conversations, right, to questions of monuments, but institutions, finding a new way forward. But I mean, we landed on what is, a same kind of dynamic, a multivocal, continuously changing, space for conversation, not one that is literally in concrete, right, meant to be for all time.
Thank you, Doug. And you mentioned John's work at the Field Museum. John, please fill us in on that, on your exhibit. And also there's we mentioned in the chat, there's an imprint that you published about the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi Indians in the city of Chicago. Tell us about that.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's actually, we pronounce it Pokagon. So it's imprints, Pokagon Band of Potawatomi in the city of Chicago, 2016. Michigan State University Press, and I make 10 cents off of every copy sold. And I'm working at the Field Museum. I went to U of Chicago a long time ago. I got a master's degree there. And the Field Museum was a different place when I was back in the 1990s. It wasn't particularly Native friendly. And it was about us in a very condescending sort of way. And, for it now, I'm not the first, but I'm a string of Native co-curators now coming to the Field Museum and doing exhibit. Mine is on black ash baskets. of the Pokake and Potawatomi. So the creativity, the artistry, the materiality, the spirit within the baskets. What about the Emerald Ash Borer and the environmental disaster going on there with black ash trees, etc. But I'm also working on, and this might be a sort of more akin to the project for tonight, is working at the MacArthur Foundation's Marquette building. They have a lobby there, 1893 lobby, Tiffany glass, bronze bas-reliefs of sort of the civilizing the discovery by Europeans of Chicago and its subsequent civilizing by white people, by explorers and missionaries. The MacArthur Foundations, we're not expecting to tear that lobby down. Nobody's suggesting that we tear down the Tiffany glass. They're beautiful mosaics, very odd and curious imagery, though, that are represented. But I don't even want to get rid of those. I don't want the racism to be erased, as somebody else said on the panel here tonight, is that we don't want to erase how we were represented in the past. We don't ever want anyone to forget. No one's getting off the hook on that. We just want to have a more accurate history represented. So MacArthur Foundation is allowing us to do an intervention, and in the lobby next to the lobby, in the second lobby, we are going to do an exhibit about ancestral and contemporary Indian Chicago. And so we're really looking forward to it. It probably will open January of next year. And so we're really excited about that. I just wanted to say one last thing about rewriting history. It tends to be sort of a pejorative, but I think as other panelists have said, history is not truth. History is perspective, right? History is always in flux. History is always in debate. History is always changing. Our understandings of the past are always changing. We do this with museums. We do this with textbooks. We do this with all sorts of things. We do this with family history. We do this with community history. It's, statues tend to be this one odd exception where, because I guess we're afraid of change, we don't want to see change, right? We're afraid, it scares us to change things. But, change is coming. And so, I think some of the statues will stay, some will be taken down, some will be contextualized, and hopefully there'll be more things added to some of them. And so we're not going to please everybody. We're not going to please everybody on the committee, right? We're not going to please, but what we want to do is have some sense of a more fair representation of everything that is Chicago.
What is the time frame for the committee's work, John? Do you have an end date when you expect to be done, and what is the next stage?
They probably do, but being a professor whose semester just ended, I don't look too far ahead. I look to winter grades too. So I think it's probably this year, but we certainly don't want to be in a sense of being in a hurry or being people don't feel like they had an opportunity to participate. So so that's what all of this is about, right? Is thinking about our history, our shared past and present, as represented sometimes in these stone things. And what do we do about that? How do we feel about that?
We've heard a lot of very rich food for thought that will contribute to this conversation tonight. I just want to close out and thank there's many suggestions that have been made in chat. Please check it out in terms of books by Kate and others resources you definitely want to check out. But I want to just ask all of you, are there other resources that you might suggest that would give us background on Lincoln, on Indigenous history, and on public art in the US, or is there anything else related to this conversation? Any other resources out there that you'd like to share?
I have
Doug?
one very quick. There's a really great episode of the NPR show This American Life about the Dakota War from a few years back called Little War on the Prairie. And if one wanted to get in 50 minutes, a quick overview of what that history is about and trying to commemorate it in Minnesota, it's a really great way to do that.
Yeah, and Doug put in the chat, in addition to that, a book about the Dakota War, 38 Nooses, Lincoln, Little Crow, and the beginning of the frontier's end. And then on Lincoln, and more focused on African Americans and questions of slavery and race. When it comes to African Americans, I would echo what somebody else earlier mentioned, Eric Foner's book, The Fiery Trial, which is an award-winning book on Lincoln, that really focuses in on issues related to slavery and race and does a very good job with them.
Christine, did you have any other thoughts or suggestions about public arts? You had a lot of great examples tonight. Any other resources out there?
I actually feel, the city has a in many ways a great website on our public art, but I wish the city could put more resources towards updating that and making that more maneuverable. I think a website like that goes to such a long way. People are hungry for that information. So I would say, please go there. We put together with students at the University of Chicago a website for our public art, and every student researched one piece and wrote the text, and it's a fabulous model. Maybe this is something that different public art classes across Chicago could take up to help beef up that city website.
Well, thank you to our esteemed panel, Doug Keel, Kate Mazur, Christine Marion, and John Lowe. You've all been superb tonight. Thank you for all the work you are doing and continuing to do. And I also want to thank our great program folks at the History Museum, Erica Griffin and Candace Bay, for all their hard work on putting this important program together. And thanks to all of you in the audience for being caring and committed about this issue and for having such great questions and comments. Thanks for joining us, and have a great evening.